The beloved, critically acclaimed Avatar: The Last Airbender occurs in a fantasy world suffused with elements from real-world East Asian and Inuit cultures. Show creators Michael DiMartino and Brian Konietzko researched East Asian mythology, history, religion, and art, collaborating with cultural consultants on the show's scripts, martial arts choreography, and Chinese calligraphy. However, M. Night Shyamalan's live-action adaptation, The Last Airbender, faced denunciations of racism and whitewashing over the film's all-white casting of its three main protagonists, leaving antagonists Zuko and the Fire Nation as visibly non-white others. Casting calls for Fire Nation extras explicitly called for non-white applicants, making the intended juxtaposition clear. In response, a staff member of the original show, using the pen name Aang Ain't White, launched a letter-writing protest movement that evolved into the race-bending website, deriving its name from the series. Yet, in an interview, Shyamalan retorted, maybe they didn't see the faces they wanted to see, but overall it is more than they could have expected. The Last Airbender released in 2010 with unchanged cast, but imploded under its abysmal quality and critical panning. However, race-bending, as an organization and as a term, outlasted the film that brought it into being, continuing to advocate for equitable racial representation in film casting. But why should the race of real-world actors portraying fictional characters from an animated fantasy setting, like that of Avatar, matter? Indeed, typical counter-arguments to racial representation objections appeal to fantasy in two ways. 1. Fictional settings are, by definition, irrelevant to real-world representation, and 2. Fantasy is trivial entertainment not worth protesting about. This presentation refutes both claims. In actuality, it is precisely within fantasy that diversity in racial and other forms of representation is most critical, since storytelling shapes audience attitudes and beliefs about real-life communities in ways not easily prevented by cognitive or cultural safeguards. Contrary to the fantasy defense, humans are inherently meaning-making interpreters, whose boundaries between reality and narrative are not rigidly defined. Whenever fictional cultures or populations are associated with a real-world culture or population, the fictional world becomes a racialized fantasy. A plethora of video game worlds qualify as racialized fantasy, providing tantalizing case studies for analyzing racial representation. After the death of George Floyd, resulting in worldwide cries for racial justice, examining racial representation in video game music is more crucial than ever. Nintendo's iconic Super Mario franchise may seem an unlikely candidate for a racialized fantasy. What does the whimsical world of Goombas and Koopas, Yoshis and Toads have to do with white and black? The series appears to exemplify both claims of the fantasy defense. However, the series' latest installment, Super Mario Odyssey, generated accusations of racism and cultural appropriation from Latinx communities over its controversial Mexico-themed level, Tostarena. Producer Yoshiaki Koizumi describes the theme of Super Mario Odyssey as world travel. Throughout the game, Mario pursues Bowser, circumnavigating a vaguely Earth-like planet and visiting various kingdoms along the way. Several are inspired by real-world locations. For example, New Donk City, the Luncheon Kingdom, Bowser's Castle, and Tostarena. By including specific references to the language, architecture, art, artifacts, clothing, cuisine, lore, and music of real countries, Odyssey creates a racialized fantasy. Some influences are rather subtle. In the Luncheon Kingdom, references to Italy include the volcanic Mount Volbono, Red Vesuvius, Greco-Roman architecture, street cafe music featuring accordion and mandolino, and abundant references to gourmet cuisine. Two other kingdoms, Tostarena and Bowser's Castle, bear more obvious cultural footprints. The Sand Kingdom Tostarena became infamous before Super Mario Odyssey ever launched. Pre-release box art and early trailer footage showcased Mario donning a sombrero and poncho in the Mexico-inspired Tostarena. The town's colorful architecture, nopales, and calacas with sombreros, ponchos, and maracas are clear references to Mexican culture. Now, while some Latinx fans praised the inclusion of Mexican elements, others objected to the depiction as stereotyping and cultural appropriation. Exasperation was specifically directed at Mario's sombrero poncho outfit, which critics described as a caricature of a stereotype, and like a thoughtless college student at Halloween. Sombreros and ponchos have long histories in media as caricatures of Mexican culture, making their ubiquity in Tostarena especially egregious. Wired calls Tostarena a clumsy mashup of Mexican stereotypes and a failure to recognize that real communities are represented by these exoticized symbols. Altogether, Tostarena comes across as a tourist's surface impressions or preconceptions of Mexico, rather than a faithful or creative portrayal. Tostarena is usually considered in isolation, but a fuller understanding requires comparison to Super Mario's penultimate kingdom, Bowser's Castle, which presents a celebration of Japanese culture eliciting universal praise. If Tostarena's Mexican elements were staid caricatures, Bowser's Castle is an intricate quilt woven from complementary patterns, conveying a multifaceted vision of Japanese culture. The Japanese influences are so prevalent and detailed that it is impossible to describe them all. I will provide a representative sample. Bowser's Kingdom is constructed as an Edo period Japanese castle, making Bowser its daimyo, or feudal lord. Its numerous Japanese references can be categorized into characters, puzzles and obstacles, and decor and architecture. I especially enjoy the Pokyo, a swashbuckling bird based on the Japanese green woodpecker, the Zen Buddhist rock garden with Jizo statues, and the photorealistic koi pond. Perhaps most strikingly, Nobori flags and Chochin paper lanterns bear kanji proclaiming Kotobuki Kuppa in a play on Bowser's Japanese name, producing the reading, "Long live Bowser." The density and synergy of these Japanese elements renders cultural analysts like Gaijin Goomba speechless. However, one crucial domain not yet mentioned is music, to which our focus now shifts, for music explains the world of difference between Tostarena's and Bowser's Castle's racial representation. Let us first turn to Tostarena. Considering Tostarena clothes its residents in sombreros and ponchos, the music used to broadcast Mexican identity is, predictably, mariachi. Mariachi is a well-known Mexican musical style, but is Odyssey's mariachi authentic? In my analysis, I draw on correspondence with Vicente Barrera, relying on his expertise in mariachi style. The area's main musical cue, Tostarena Town, signals mariachi through its melody, alternating between 2 trumpets and 2 violins. Additionally, the guitar features a percussive hit akin to a snare drum, a timbre characteristic of mariachi. A second cue, Dancing with New Friends, plays if Mario dons sombrero and poncho and plays guitar for dancing Tostarenans, also evoking mariachi through its 2-trumpet melody and foregrounded guitar. Thus, it is clear that composer Naoto Kubo intended to reference mariachi in both cues. However, Tostarena's music diverges from traditional mariachi practice in several ways. Authentic mariachi is primarily characterized by its instrumentation, especially its core rhythm section comprised of 3 guitar family instruments: guitarron, classical nylon string guitar, and vihuela. However, in Tostarena, an electric bass substitutes for guitarron, and a contemporary steel string guitar for the smaller vihuela. The track also adds bongos, tambourine, and accordion, instruments not found in traditional mariachi. Also, the slides and grace note ornamentation in the trumpets and violins are exaggerated and used too frequently for the style, revealing the track's underlying exoticism. These departures from mariachi tradition, especially its signature instrumentation, show that Tostarena's music is far from authentic. Bowser's Castle also musically communicates cultural associations through its instrumentation and melodic conventions. Here, I draw on correspondence with Liam Heinz Tawa for his expertise in Japanese music theory and style. Bowser's Castle features 3 musical cues, each referencing a different Japanese musical function or genre. Bowser's Castle prominently features the 3 instruments of the Sankyoku ensemble, koto, shamisen, and shakuhachi, with taiko drum accompaniment. Before Bowser's Castle, main courtyard, consists of a taiko ensemble with a texture reminiscent of introductory gestures for kabuki theater. Finally, Bowser's Castle main courtyard adds kane bells to the taiko ensemble, featuring shinobue flute melody and occasional shamisen. Additionally, the track's pitch material is organized according to existing Japanese modes. Bowser's Castle contains elements exhibiting minyo, ritsu, and miyako bushi modes. and the Shinobue in Main Courtyard presents a pure Myakobushi mode melody. The traditional treatment of these melodies performed on Japanese instruments enhances the music's cultural identity. At this point, the argument seems clear-cut. Bowser's Castle's music is authentic, while Tostorena's is not, hence their differing reception. But this would be too hasty, as Bowser's Castle's cues also contain inauthentic elements, most notably the European string and brass sections in both tracks. Additionally, these European instruments play pitches or chords not included in the Japanese modes performed by the melody. In Bowser's Castle, the strings and brass emphasize the flat 2 chord and lowered 2nd scale degree not found within the prevailing Minyo mode. In Main Courtyard, the strings include the 3 chord built on the lowered 3rd scale degree, which is foreign to the Myakobushi mode. These European instruments thus complicate any reading of pristine musical authenticity. What shall we say? Is the music of Bowser's Castle as problematic as Tostorena's faux mariachi on account of its own inauthenticities? But this would flout widespread reception patterns and intuition. What we need is a criteria other than authenticity to evaluate this music. The literature on exoticism and Orientalism reveals that discourse over authenticity often ultimately contributes to dynamics of commodification, appropriation, and power. From Oriental carpets and musical Indianisms to avant-garde concert music and the world music genre, truly authentic elements may be fixated upon and commodified as markers of racial difference. Likewise, inauthenticity can empower artists pigeonholed into a narrow conception of ethnic music, such as the hybridity movement in Punjabi British Bhangra music. In other words, not all inauthenticity is equal. Just as authenticity can be co-opted in dynamics of power, commercialization, and appropriation, music external to a style may be adapted for rhetorical ends. Thus, semiotic analysis of the logic underlying each kingdom's music is key to understanding their stark difference in impact. First, consider the bass line and guitar strum pattern of Tostarena Town, emphasizing a dotted eighth, eighth note rhythm, which strikes Barrera as atypical to mariachi style. This rhythm actually originates from Cuba's son cubano style, specifically the 3-side of the son clave, and is popularly known as the tresillo. Cuban influence also explains the presence of bongos, as they are part of the core rhythm section of son cubano. Now, syncretism is not necessarily inauthentic to mariachi, as many mariachi classics originate from other genres such as Tejano, Cuban danzón, and Colombian cumbia. However, it is most likely that Naoto Kubo conflated different Latin American musical styles, probably exposed to Cuban elements without sufficiently differentiating them from Mexican mariachi. What mattered most to Kubo was not that the music be Mexican per se, but that it signal Latin American associations to hearers. From across the ocean, distinguishing Cuban and Mexican music seemed unnecessary. They were Latin enough to play the role as far as Japanese, and, too often, American, audiences were concerned. There is also the very choice of mariachi music to represent Mexico. Out of the plethora of traditional Mexican musical genres, why pick mariachi? Answer: mariachi most clearly and immediately communicates Mexican cultural identity to players. In other words, mariachi is stereotypical Mexican music, the musical analog to Mario's poncho and sombrero outfit. Though mariachi is genuinely Mexican music with a rich history, from a non-Mexican perspective, it is also a surefire means to musically encode Mexican identity. The stereotype flattens multifaceted Mexican musical culture into an oral calling card, just as conflating Mexican and Cuban elements reduces distinct Latinx cultures into a pan-Latin conglomerate. Here lies the crucial problem with Tostorena's music and cultural representation. Not inauthenticity per se, but stereotyping. As Janet Garcia writes, we as Mexican people are not ponchos and sombreros, or for that matter, mariachi music. Cultures are complex entities, and any representation not reflecting that nuance is bound to alienate real-life communities. However, 2 lessons drawn from the music of Bowser's Castle gesture toward a better way. As with Tostarena, examining musical inauthenticities reveals the track's underlying hermeneutic premise. In both Bowser's Castle and Main Courtyard, the brass and strings are conspicuously non-Japanese and play pitches not included in the traditional Japanese modes established by the Japanese instruments. However, it is precisely this tension and juxtaposition between Japanese and European music that encodes Kubo's underlying cultural argument. Let's analyze the music of Bowser's Castle through a narrative lens, taking Japanese and European instruments as emblematic of their respective cultures. The track exhibits a traditional Japanese formal structure, jo-ha-kyu, in which a stable texture is destabilized by a rising, quickening tension, resulting in a climactic tearing away or scattering gesture before a rapid denouement. The jo consists primarily of Japanese instruments and harmony, destabilized in the ha by the introduction of the flat 2 chord and European brass, which leads to a frenzied chromatic cue with strings and shamisen together. This music stages an encounter between Japanese and European musical elements, each vying to exert dominance over the other. However, due to the looping nature of most video game music, Japanese and European musical elements coexist in continual dialogue, each defining and being defined by the other. In the soundtrack of Bowser's Castle, Kubo presents a musical staging of Japan's history in relation to Europe, including its catastrophic outcome in the Second World War and subsequent reconstruction. Musically, the cue encodes Japan's ongoing project to incorporate European harmony and instrumentation while maintaining its distinct heritage and traditions. The resulting sonic cocktail provides the Japanese instruments a globalized, larger-than-life stage on which to perform. I have shown that the semiotic rhetoric of Bowser's Castle exceeds easy categorization as authentic or inauthentic. In conclusion, we can now formulate 2 principles of positive cultural representation. 1. Productively and creatively combine elements internal and external to a culture to advance a broader rhetorical, cultural, or narrative argument. The music of Bowser's Castle elicits awe rather than ire because its fusion of Japanese and European style is semiotically intentional, producing an artistically satisfying result. In contrast, the irregularities in Tostarena's music reveal a clumsy, low-resolution, pan-Latin caricature. This leads to the second principle. 2. Draw from multiple diverse, non-stereotypical sources to present a multi-dimensional picture of a culture. Even if Tostarena's sombreros, ponchos, and mariachi had been accurate and authentic, they would remain predictable, eye-roll-worthy caricatures. What if Tostarena had channeled the incredible regional diversity of Mexico's music, fashion, architecture, climates, customs, and lore? Likewise, the taiko drums or the samurai costume in Bowser's Castle could have been stereotypical if those were the sole markers of Japanese identity. There's no excuse for developers' cultural research, musical or otherwise, to rely on staged stereotypes like mariachi or ponchos. However, as proven by the original Avatar: The Last Airbender, if a racialized fantasy can capture a portion of the breadth and depth of a real-life culture, both the culture and the work would be celebrated. It's time to jump up in